Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this week's Skwawk Talk on Socialist Telly. Assaults on democracy and shoddy behaviour by the Labour Party is our theme in two different ways tonight on the programme. And I'm delighted to welcome, sad that I have to talk to him about it, but delighted to welcome Darren McLaughlin from Bristol, who is a former council candidate for the Labour Party and is currently in the, ongoing throes of a 10-month suspension by the party with no idea as to when that's going to end. We'll be talking about the latest party attack on democracy, and particularly the assault that's going on at the moment on conference delegates and their entitlement to attend conference and vote on various issues which are important to within the party and that the Labour right wants a particular result on. And we also have Paul Burnham here from Haringey, who is part of Haringey Defended Council Housing, to talk about, again, ongoing situations in that borough, a notionally Labour-run borough, but run by the Labour right again after a recent coup, and the assault on housing that's going on there and the way in which people have been marched into voting against their own interests, really, to, and voting for gentrification. And we'll talk about gentrification as well, I think, in general. In London is the major issue that it is. So, gents, thank you for joining me. If you're watching the program live, then thank you very much for your time. If you're watching it on catch up, likewise. And as usual, the obligatory reminder: don't forget to do your bits and pieces on your favorite social media channel to subscribe and get notified as to when new programs come out, so you can make sure that you get the latest information as it comes out. Darren, let's start with you if we can, and I suspect that Paul will have a few things he wants to come in on this as well. Tell us a little bit about your kind of, history over the last 10 months, let's say.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for inviting me on the show. Last year, I was the secretary of Bristol West CLP, which was the second largest CLP in the country at the time. And on the day the EHRC report came out, one of the branches of Bristol West CLP, the East and Lawrence Hill branch, happened to have a meeting taking place that evening. So one of our members submitted an emergency motion in support of Jeremy Corbyn and calling him to be reinstated, and saying that what was taking place was an attack on the left of the party, essentially. So that motion was passed by East and Lawrence Hill branch. So the secretary of that branch then passed it over to me as CLP secretary and said they wanted us to hear that as a CLP. So I had a discussion with my co-secretary and the chair, and we discussed it amongst ourselves and decided that it was our role and responsibility to allow the voice of members to be heard. So we agreed to call a meeting at which this motion would be heard. And in the couple of weeks, in the week or so subsequent to that, because you need to give 7 days advance notice of any meeting taking place according to the rules. So in the week or so after that took place, David Evans sent an email out to all secretaries and chairs of CLPs in the country, saying that they were not to allow any kind of debate or discussion on the content of the AHRC report, which we said, fine, that's fine. We agree to that. That seems reasonable. So, but what we wanted to discuss was the suspension, the very obviously unfair suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the party. So we decided to put this meeting on. We received some kind of threatening emails from the regional secretary of the regional director of Labour in the Southwest, warning us to not put this meeting on, or there would be consequences. And we also received emails from our MP, Thangan Debonair, similarly kind of reinforcing this and saying, I'm not sure if you've heard, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the party is saying that you can't discuss these matters, that you're not to discuss these matters. And we said, well, we're not here to debate or to question the EHRC report. That's a separate matter entirely. What we're here to do is to allow our members to discuss whether or not they want to support Jeremy Corbyn and see him reinstated into the party. So that meeting did take place. we structured the meeting in such a way as that we would not infringe the kind of directives that had come from David Evans about debating or questioning the validity of the HRC report, which means that we had a Zoom meeting and that people were not free to unmute themselves and that there was no free chat taking place. And so the only chat that could happen was direct to the chair, not amongst each other. And the first thing that our chair did was to take a vote on whether or not this motion should be heard at all. We had about 200 people attending this meeting. So it was a very large meeting that was very kind of well attended, including Thang and Debonair, who also attended the meeting. And we had this kind of meeting and we took this vote and it was agreed that the motion should be heard. And then we said, okay, does anyone wish to make any amendments to the motion? And so we said that we would accept motions being sent through the chat function to the chair. And then we presented the amendments that people wish to make. And then we voted on whether we should accept or reject any of them. And then we took the final version, the final wording of the motion and presented it to the meeting, said, do you wish to kind of vote for this, yes or no? And we voted in favor of it by a kind of overwhelming majority. A week or so later, my chair, Hannah Little, and co-secretary, Paul Tasman, received a letter of suspension from the Labour Party. But I didn't receive a letter of suspension, and I wasn't quite sure why that was. And I'm not sure altogether why that is still now, but in the letter that was sent to them, they had screenshots of emails and kind of social media posts which showed that they were aware that they were not supposed to do this and that they did it anyway. And I hadn't engaged in any kind of communication, which means they didn't have any of that kind of evidence. So I wasn't suspended and they were. So I then tried to continue to run the business of the CLP for the next few weeks without their support. And it was coming close to our AGM. So I was just going to try and run the AGM and then I was going to probably step down from my role. And then just in a couple of days before the AGM was due to take place, I received a letter of myself also suspending me. So for anyone who doesn't know, if you receive a letter from the Labour Party, from the governance and legal unit of the Labour Party, what they usually do is send you a letter and say, did you do this? Did you write that? Did you say this? And then you have 7 days to respond to them, say, yes, I did. No, I didn't. And explain your actions. So I replied to them and explained my actions. And then I didn't hear anything from them for a long time. So the other thing that's relevant to note is that I was also a council candidate for the local elections that were due to take place. Originally, they would have taken place in May 2020, and then they got delayed by a year because of COVID. So they were due to take place in May 2021. So the fact that I was suspended whilst we were in the kind of run up towards the local election taking place meant that was a bit of a concern. So many of our members and many of the other council candidates kind of tried their best to try to get me reinstated. So they wrote letters to the NEC. They tried to get the support of the Labour local council. They contacted the regional office. They tried to get the support of the MP to try to get me reinstated, because obviously it would be detrimental to the Labour Party locally if I wasn't able to stand. And there was also one other candidate who was also suspended and also wasn't able to stand. So letters were sent to the NEC, and members of the NEC replied to say they understood our concerns. They understood that it would be a worry and that it might potentially damage us in the local elections, and that they had received assurances that any cases like mine would be addressed and dealt with by the new year, so that there was a clear run, which means that we could then focus on campaigning for the local elections. And this word that came back saying, with the assurance that it would be dealt with by the new year, that didn't come to pass. And then people wrote subsequently to say what was going on, and we just weren't getting any answers. So in January, I received another letter from the governance and legal unit after months of no communication, which asked me to clarify a couple of points. It said, can you just clarify these 2 points? And gave me 7 days to respond. So I did respond within the 7 days in February. And now I haven't heard a word back from them since February. And there's no explanation as to why that is. And I know that other people have contacted the NEC to see what the situation is with my case, and they've had no response. And my co-secretary and the chair have both been reinstated. They were reinstated weeks ago. So I know I was involved a little bit with the Save Our Socialist campaign, which you may have heard about, which was a campaign that was brought together to kind of support chairs and secretaries of CLPs across the country who were suspended for the crime of allowing motions to be heard or meetings to take place in support of Jeremy Corbyn. And as far as I'm aware, the vast majority of these chairs and secretaries have been reinstated, and I haven't. And there's no clear explanation for why that is. I have my suspicions. I mean, I think it's odd. I mean, another thing that's worth noting is that I'm a graduate of the Bernie Grant Leadership Program, which is the program that the Labour Party implemented in 2019 with the purpose of trying to kind of develop and support and advance its BAME activists in the party, because the party recognizes that there is a lack of BAME activists who take on leadership roles in the party, whether that be kind of CLP executive roles, or whether that's as councillors or even potentially as MPs. And they wish to kind of get more BAME activists into these positions. So that's why they put on the Bernie Grant Leadership Program, named in honor of Bernie Grant, who was one of the first Black MPs elected in this country, elected in the 1980s as part of the same cohort as Paul Boateng, Diane Abbott, and Keith Vaz. And so we had BAME activists from all around the country who took part in that. So it does seem kind of strange and disappointing that a graduate of this program, someone who's demonstrated their commitment to the Labour Party and Labour values through taking on the role of a secretary of a large CLP and for standing as a council, has been suspended. So I think it may potentially have something to do with the fact that I'm an elected member of the Momentum National Coordinating Group. So I think it's possible that I'm a political target, and that's why they don't want to readmit me.
Yes.
I'll leave it there. I've talked for a while.
Well, I mean, you wrote an article for Tribune where you outlined some of the political consequences for the Labour Party of the way that they behave towards you. Do you want to give a little bit more information on that, because it kind of prefigures what's going on at the moment, really?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that Bristol has been targeted and hit particularly hard by the wave of suspensions and by what some could say and could see is a factional war against the left, because the chair, I as secretary, and my co-secretary and chair were suspended. We were from Bristol West CLP. The chair and secretary of Bristol East CLP were also suspended. The chair and secretary of Bristol North West CLP were also suspended. Bristol South, their chair and secretary were not suspended, but I don't know quite why that is. But I think it might just be because there was a window of less than a week. There was a few days in which the guidance changed on what you could and could not discuss regarding Jeremy Corbyn and the EHRC report and that sort of thing. So they managed to escape it, but also surrounding CLPs like Kingswood CLP have also suffered, and others are in the kind of southwest. So I think the southwest has been targeted particularly hard. I think the reasons for that are there's a very left-wing active membership, generally speaking, across Bristol. So what ended up happening was Bristol City Council, up until this year, out of 70 councillors, 35 of them were Labour. So there are 4 constituencies. There are 4 Labour MPs and a Labour mayor and a Labour council. So it's a kind of strong red Labour city. But after several of their kind of leading activists were suspended, and it wasn't just the CLP secretaries and chairs, there were other people also suspended. I think a lot of people in the Labour Party got upset, and they started to feel like they weren't valued, that they weren't represented, that the Labour Party wasn't the party that represented their values anymore, that maybe it was no longer some kind of a democratic socialist party, which is what it's supposed to be. So a lot of people said that they weren't willing to campaign for these local elections. There was obviously the difficulties of it being COVID anyway, which means that normally you would have been out with teams of people door knocking. I mean, in the 2019 general election, you could have seen like teams of 50 people out just going through the streets, knocking doors. We had so many active members in Bristol that we were sending teams of people out to campaign in surrounding marginal constituencies in the southwest. We were sending teams to Gloucester, Stroud, the Vale of Glamorgan, Plymouth, Cornwall, because people were fighting so hard for a Labour government. They thought it's not enough to just campaign here on our doorstep where we know that we've already got a strong chance of winning. We should be sending people out to where they're needed in the surrounding constituencies. But the Labour Party have taken that enthusiasm and drive, and they've just poured water on it. They just diminished it. They just made people not kind of think that their contribution isn't valued. I mean, especially after we heard, the stories come out about the way that people who are employed by the Labour Party and people who are elected MPs in the Labour Party didn't want the Labour Party to win in 2019.
Yeah.
Finding that out was a shock to the system. So a lot of people felt like they just didn't have the enthusiasm. So the end result is Labour dropped from having 35 councillors and having a majority in Bristol City Council to only having 24, and now the Green Party have 24 councillors too. So now they're on even level pegging. So the seat that I was due to stand in had one Labour councillor and one Green councillor, which means it was a winnable ward. And I'm quite involved in environmental campaigning, and I care about green issues, which means that I could compete with the Green Party because we were talking about similar policies. And I could say, yes, but the only way you can implement these things is through socialism. You can't do it without doing it through socialism, which means I think that I could have been quite persuasive in talking to the voters. I've been door knocking in that ward twice a week for months. So I really knew the ward well, and I knew what their local issues and concerns were. And I had been putting out leaflets, and I had been organising public-facing meetings, which means I was very well prepared. It's the ward that I lived in as well. So I'd lived there for years. I knew the local businesses, which means I was well prepared to stand as a candidate in that ward. But then they didn't allow me to stand, and then they replaced me with another candidate, and then the net result was we lost both of them, and now it's two Green Party councillors in that ward.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it was obvious from the revelations of the leaked Labour report that despite using it against the left and saying the left was only interested in internal power and not in winning the elections, it was actually the left who were trying to win the elections and the right who didn't care about getting into power as long as they could regain control within the party. And since they did regain control within the party, they still don't seem to have any real interest in winning the elections, except when it comes to the point where they think they're going to, it might cost Keir Starmer his job or whatever, then they suddenly get a bit interested. But, they've taken out councillors beyond the point where it was possible even to put another candidate up and lost seats because of that. We've seen them, kind of languishing in the polls, and one poll they're clinging to this week, which saw the Tories fall, but Labour only gained, 5 points. The Tories lost, Labour gained 1 point, and, all the rest of the support went to other parties. So, Labour is desperately unpopular at the moment. And
I think Labour to win would be renaming themselves Labour to lose, because they are taking Labour on a losing streak. They're losing the election, and we'll come back
to that in a bit, because I want to bring Paul in shortly. But I mean, it's worth pointing out, as people will be aware probably who are watching, that we've just seen an absolutely atrocious series of attacks really on the chair of Young Labour, a young woman who was, despite the, having already publicly said that she was feeling stressed and her mental health was under pressure because of attacks in the media on her, which appeared to be coordinated. We then saw this 1 a.m. completely unauthorized email going out to her, warning her that she was under investigation for, supposed that, essentially what it came down to was she'd stood up to somebody who was being homophobic. And they were going to, they threatened her with being penalised for that, and then scrambled and backed down. But that was a purely factional attack on somebody because they wanted, they want to take out Young Labour and decapitate the organisation, because, as far as can be seen, because it's it's determined it's going to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, and there are people on the right who don't want that to happen. So that's. That, and those, one of the groups you mentioned is, is kind of somewhere in and around the fringes of that, it would appear, and and are also then still now, even now at conference, and this is where, where this is very current now, because your situation started a while ago. But, the attack on Barnard was clearly intended to stop her and her organization being able to participate in the conference. But then now, because Unite have said that they are going to vote against David Evans, Keir Starmer's pick for General Secretary, being confirmed in the role, because he's only acting General Secretary at the moment. They seem to have suddenly got spooked among the Labour right and are pushing to try to kick out as many people who are delegates to the conference as possible, because they think that, normally with the union block vote, if all the unions go one direction, that's going to decide the issue. But with Unite and probably some of the other left unions saying that they're going to vote against Evans being confirmed and for a plan to make MPs answerable to conference, because at the moment they're a law to themselves and they behave like it, most of them as well. They've suddenly got scared that they're going to lose those votes, and it would be a big setback for them. So they're busy, as we saw the attack on democracy and free speech when they, went after people in Bristol and elsewhere. They're now mounting a massive attack on the democratic rights of members and the, rights and purse strings of delegates in a lot of cases who've already booked to go to conference, and trying to kick out as many of them as possible so they can't vote on behalf of their members. Because they want a shell of democracy, but they don't want to risk of anything going in the way that in the way that they don't plan for. So that's the Labour right on the kind of purely political front. Now, Paul, let's talk a little bit about what the Labour right is doing down there in Haringey, because we saw a brief interregnum where we had a left council leader in Haringey, but on either side of that, they seem to have been busy trying to demolish people's council homes and either, tell them they should be grateful that it's being done, or persuade them even to vote against their own interests, and get them to vote for the demolition of houses that they live in to be replaced by houses that they'll never be able to afford to live in. So give us a little bit about the background on that, if you would, please.
Okay, thanks for inviting me on the show, and thanks for responding to the stuff we've been putting out. I'd just like to say that housing really is an absolutely central issue in working class politics. It's an absolutely central part of the movement for a better world, that we take control of the areas we live in, we take control of the building industry, and that we actually build homes that are decent, secure, have permanent tenancies, and so on. So this has always been a major part of socialist politics. It's obviously been a major part of the Labour Party. Back in the day, the Conservatives as well used to promise to build large amounts of council housing and so on. And it's gradually been wound back over a long period of time, going back to Thatcher, as we know. And then it's gone on steroids really since 2010. So we've had the credit crunch, we had a world financial crisis, and then we have the idea, but it's welfare. The reason, as we know, the reason why we have a world financial crisis, there's too many swimming pools, too many libraries, too many council houses. We give too much support to people on benefit who need support. Ludicrous idea, but this grasps the centre of political debate. It gets driven through by government. And one of the things that's happened, especially in London, especially in the cities, is been demolition of council estates starting to be proposed on an industrial scale. Now, and this came to its worst when Cameron was Prime Minister under a Conservative government after 2015, short-lived Conservative government, if you like. That was the worst point. Now, what's important to say is we are winning on this stuff. We're pushing this back. This agenda has gone back when Theresa May came in, and it's been pushed back further because of the resistance of mainly of tenants, not exclusively of tenants and other residents on council estates, the general population, the general awareness, the general movement, exemplified in things like the Jeremy Corbyn movement in the Labour Party, saying that no, council housing is valuable and we need to keep it. And then in Haringey, we have a particular situation where we have a well-loved local football club you'll be familiar with, Tottenham Hotspur, and they have a well-loved football stadium called White Hart Lane, and a railway station called White Hart Lane where the fans come to watch the team, and they walk from the railway station to the football ground. In between, there is a shock horror, a council estate. And the directors of Tottenham Hotspur were very unhappy about this being the case. They wanted to get rid of it. And they've just built a new stadium there, people may know. Before they built the stadium, they went to the council and said, we're going to leave the area. It's the biggest business in the borough, of course. They said, we're going to leave the area unless you get rid of that estate. And the council agreed with Spurs to actually redevelop the Love Lane estate, it's called. They made an agreement, private agreement, with Tottenham Hotspur in the beginning of 2013. And the last however many years it's been since then, 9 years, have been trying to push through this programme, which has developed into a huge gentrification and social cleansing programme in North Tottenham. So it's a deprived area. It's a, don't particularly like describing it like that. So it is a mixed working class area, and they want to take those elements out of it. And the council leadership at that particular time made a turn of having done nothing much for years on end, suddenly made a turn to wanting to knock down council estates and make agreements with property developers to do it. So the developer they brought in is a company called Lend-Lease, and then there was a struggle over a plan to redevelop large areas of the borough, large amounts of council estates, and as a result of that, 22 councillors got deselected. The decision was made to sign up to this company, but it was never enacted. There was legal actions against it. There were demonstrations against it, and so on. And the new leadership came in and actually decided not to do that and not to make that agreement. But the Love Lane estate was separate to the HDB. It was a split off part of the same plan with the same developer doing exactly the same kind of thing. And this is kind of continued to rumble away throughout the period since then. And then what's then happened is the Greater London then is putting £90 million into this scheme, which is a negative scheme. It's negative for local people. That there are promises to it. It's not just that they're going to build private housing. They are going to rehouse the people whose homes they're going to demolish. There are promises being made to the residents of the existing homes, but the additional homes being built are going to be disproportionately market homes that local people cannot afford. So basically, the whole idea is to drive up local house prices, drive up local market rents, drive up local retail costs, and then anybody who can't afford to pay can go and live in Edmonton. Go and move out of the other side of the North Circular. And this is a process that is going on. It's going on around the country. It's going on around the world. To be absolutely honest, and just to say again, this is not just something terrible where we are losing and having our hides whipped. It's something where we are standing back and saying, why should it be like this? We need alternatives, and so on. Now, part of that was the Labour Party's programme at the last general election of building 100,000 new council homes a year with government grant to do that, and that's been dropped, and not much has been heard about it since Starmer has been the leader. But I'm very pleased to hear that there's a motion coming forward at the conference, basically saying to reinstate it. The Labour Party should be demanding this of a Tory government. Don't wait until there's a Labour government. People can't wait that long. Saying this is the right policy, we demand that the government enact it. So there's all that going on. And then in the meantime, we have something else that's happened is that the Greater London agreed there should be demolition ballots. So up until 2018, it used to be the case that local authority could just decide to knock down a council estate. So this is part of democratic advance. We say it's not good enough. We put forward an argument about it. It then gets, it was put forward by motion by Tottenham constituency Labour Party at the 2017 conference. It was picked up by Corbyn in his speech the next day. Local authorities, including Labour local authorities, went bananas about this because it's inconvenient for them. They don't like the idea, but it got adopted by Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London. So we then have ballots on demolitions. So we then get to a position where in Love Lane, the council actually calls a ballot they've been talking about for years and years and years, and this took place in August and September. And as Defend Council Housing, we went round talking to people, and we're not just telling people to vote no to this. We're not telling them they shouldn't vote yes, because it is their decision. So we respect as we all know as canvassers, you can't just tell people what they should be doing. You have to find out what they're interested in doing, what their priorities are, and then perhaps let them know about some of the upsides and downsides of some of the proposals, some of the things going on behind it, and so on. So we did all that, and then we found that what the council were actually doing were using a lot of our rent money, by the way, to do it. Was sending out teams of people, creating manufactured consent, like knocking on people's doors during the ballot, phoning people up during the ballot, and asking them, basically telling them they should vote yes, and going the final step really of asking to vote yes in front of the officers, actually taking the ballot papers away, and so on. So and this is just a step too far. Then we come to the result of the ballot. The result of the ballot is that there were 113 votes for demolition and 90 votes against, on a turnout of 69%. So the overall picture then is that what the council needed to have, and what the Greater London needed to have, was a convincing victory in a valid ballot. And basically they failed to do that, because it's not an overwhelming result when 38% of people vote for this plan that they've told everybody is so marvellous, and 30 people vote against. That's not particularly overwhelming. But if the ballot was a valid ballot, then it would stand. But it is not acceptable to treat people in this way. And then, so going back to the significant, as we all know, voting is fantastically important. The fact that you are actually asked your opinion about something did not just happen. It had to be fought for, it had to be established. We have to establish it in the workplace. We establish it in parliamentary elections. So we have the secret ballot in parliamentary elections since 1872. It hasn't always been there. It was established because before that there was landlord intimidation, there was employer intimidation. If your landlord stood for Parliament and the voting was open, you'd better damn well vote for them. If you voted against them, or heaven said, campaigned against them, you would become homeless. That is the reality of what it used to be like. Right? Those threats are not being made now, but the right to have a free and fair expression of voting includes things like voting in your own time, includes things like thinking about it. When somebody comes and puts an argument to you, say, well, okay, so it's a good argument, I'll think about it. And then the voter decides, shall I vote for you? Shall I vote the other way? Shall I bother to vote or not? Shall I bother to vote or not? All this is really important. So, we're now having a campaign. I just finished. We wrote to the ballot administration company. It used to be, or people will be familiar with, the Electoral Reform Society, run trade union ballots and so on. It now turns out that their ballot function's been bought up by, guess what, a global multinational outsourcing company called Civica. But when I wrote to Civica about some of the maladministration of the ballot, and they wrote back and said that Haringey Council had asked the ballot administrator, whether they could collect ballots on the doorstep, and the ballot administrator said no. But we know this happened, so this is a huge issue, and it is really important to get it out there to the movement. And I just finished by saying that in 2021, I don't think any other voter would face that level of pressure to vote in a ballot, because it's accepted now in trade union ballots that you vote the way that you feel, and if, as and when you want to. Certainly in parliamentary elections, it's accepted. What we want is the same privilege, it's not a privilege, the same right extended to council tenants and estates and residents on council estates. And when we get it, we will stop these schemes. We will stop our city being socially cleansed and stop it being gentrified.
I think, yeah, I mean, a couple of things jump out at me from that. I mean, one is, this was 12 votes in the other direction.
Yeah.
Would have been enough to swing the result there. So this, the pressuring and the intimidation, whatever else that went with this, wouldn't have to have a massive effect in order to be decisive. And I will say as well, I did invite the council to come on this program and defend their actions. and they didn't even bother to respond. So, they're not interested in accountability from that point of view, as far as I can tell. But the other thing that really jumps out is, I mean, in what universe would people, without being pressured or manipulated into doing it, vote for the demolition of their houses when they're not going to get a house back in the same place, and they're going to have to, they're going to be forced to resettle somewhere that's less convenient? It really does seem bizarre to me that, that they think that this kind of result would happen without, somebody twisting somebody's arm, or another way, in some other way, kind of manipulating people and steering them into which way they were going to vote. From what I know of the HDV, because I covered that at the time, this other plan that the then right-wing council had was very similar. There were all kinds of woolly, kind of assurances about, that it would be better in the end, but really nothing was there for the people who were going to be turfed out of their homes in order to make room for this project. So, that I think well done for standing up against it. But I hope that the fight is going to be, is going to continue and get lots of public support, because, there is far too much of this, and the fact that it's a Labour council is just an absolute disgrace. We've seen, whenever the Labour right gets involved in anything, and sadly they always do when there's any kind of power or influence to be had, it ends up becoming toxic. We saw in Birmingham, the council trying to put fire and rehire on their bin workers before fire and rehire was even really recognised as a thing.
Yeah.
We've seen, all around the country, councils behaving. We've seen the Labour right in the Northwest deciding that the candidates that the candidate that looked likely to win the mayoral selection in this city where I live wasn't the one they wanted, so they just took them out of the contest altogether, all three of the candidates at the time, and then it imposed somebody else on it, basically. So it's the Labour right is not really interested in democracy, and they're not, they're apparently not really interested in winning power through any democratic means, which kind of leads us on. And again, I hope it's going to be a kind of two-sided discussion here between you guys, because I think you'll both have something interesting to say about it. But, the Labour right has been now announcing its planned national executive rule changes, where they are, looking to do essentially what they did already to would-be parliamentary candidates, which is force them all into a cookie-cutter mould and deprive Labour members of the opportunity to vote for anybody that doesn't, isn't basically kind of Keir Starmer's mini-me. So, they're going to put them through vetting. They're going to put them through, a standards test where if you don't meet the standards, and we've seen what the standards are going to be, are you going to say boo to a goose? Are you ever going to disagree with the Labour leader's line? Are you ever going to stand up and actually fight for people if the interests of the people don't coincide with the interests of the leadership, etc.? And what we're seeing essentially is the Labour right, in the form of Labour to Win, primarily getting to make the rules in the party, and then pick and choose which ones they're going to actually enforce or not. Because if a rule doesn't suit what they want to do, they just ignore it. And I will point out that one of the key rule changes they made here is that they are replacing the entire disciplinary process in the party, pretty much with their own version. But instead of having, the National Constitutional Committee, which was a democratically elected and quasi-judicial system that was legally advised and had to stick to standards of decisions that would essentially stand up in a court of law, now what we're seeing is that David Evans, who hasn't even been confirmed as General Secretary yet, which is why they're probably in the middle of this delegate purge at the moment, will get to hand-pick the board, which will hand-pick the people who are going to be making these decisions. And you just, it does remind me, and I'm always very loth to go here, but it does remind me of 1930s Germany, where, one party decided they were going to kind of play the democratic game until they got in and then sweep away any democracy. And, we've seen the Labour right, Keir Starmer campaign on 10 pledges that went through the shredder as fast as he could move once he got in. And they didn't just ignore the pledges, but went in the absolute opposite direction of in their own kind of factional purges. So, guys, I don't know, Paul, whether this is of interest to you. I'm not sure if you're a member of the Labour Party or not, but, let's have a discussion about the Labour right and their concerns for the public and their concerns for democracy, because I think that's really coming to the fore at the moment. And if there was a media worth the name in this country, certainly among the mainstream, as they're so called, this would be a massive scandal. The fact that it's not just goes to show how corrupt the whole system is.
Yeah. Well, I think it is right that any candidate for any position of authority or election in the Labour Party should go through a vetting process. It's just that the vetting process they should go through is being vetted by local members, because that's really where the decision should lie. And they're trying to eliminate that. They're trying to replace that with a system in which members who are putting themselves forward for election into any elected role or potentially a kind of national or local election will be vetted by people who are approved by David Evans and Keir Starmer and the people that surround them, which they want. Basically, they want to see a return to the kind of period that we saw before under Tony Blair, in which Tony Blair and the people around him got to handpick their chosen favourites and then parachute them into safe seats. And that's just what they want to see again. And they would like to see an opportunity where they can pick people who are celebrities in some guise, which is why they want to waive the rule which says that you have to be a Labour Party member for 1 year, or you're eligible to be considered to be a candidate for any election. So it's funny because in the Labour List article that came out today regarding this taking place, Luke Akehurst, NEC member and co-director of Labour to Win, said, "I'm puzzled by the attitudes that might have led to Momentum finding uncontentious rule change like this problematic. It's obvious that any political party needs to have the right to reject membership applications for members who do not share its values, e.g. racists, to insist that people who run for public office are properly trained, and to take action at people who hold office as Labour MPs or councillors do something that is grossly detrimental to the party." But the thing I would point out is that actually there are several members of the Labour right, councillors and MPs, who are guilty of behaviour like racism and who are never held to account. The only times I ever hear about people being held accountable is if they're from the left wing of the party. And there are people from the right wing of the party who have been guilty of homophobia, of sectarianism, of racism, and I don't ever hear about them ever facing any consequences. And I think it's very funny to me that Luke Akehurst would say that it's obvious that any political party should have the right to reject members from applications from people who do not share its values, because I would question what its values are. What is this set of values? Is there an agreed set of values that we can actually measure this behavior against or not? Is it an arbitrary decision in which people like Luke Akehurst get to decide what Labour Party values are or are not? Because I think that seems like it could be taking us down an undemocratic pathway, because I've got my Labour membership card here, and on my Labour membership card it says the Labour Party is a democratic socialist party that believes by the strength of our common endeavour we achieve more than we achieve alone, etc., etc., etc. So how many members of the Labour Party and how many members of the Labour right would describe themselves as democratic socialists? As far as I'm concerned, that is the agreed set of principles of the Labour Party. This is the party that was established by the workers, by the trade union movement, and it is a party that is meant to be working towards democratic socialism, towards common ownership of the means of production, towards workers' ownership of the fruit of their own labour. Is that the values of the Labour Party that we're going to be holding people to as a set of standards? That's what I
think it's, just in case people who are watching aren't aware, let's look at some of the examples of that kind of conduct as well that haven't been punished. We've seen a front bench, in fact, two front bench MPs on individual occasions say, be involved in grossly racist conduct towards Gypsy Roma traveller communities. And that's at a time where we've now got the Tory government saying that they think that discriminating against Gypsy people and black people is, I forget exactly the term they use, but, logically justified. And, we've got the Labour Party doing that. We've seen multiple examples of grossly anti-Muslim stuff. We've seen anti-black racism. We've seen the targeting of black people within the party. We've seen, the Labour Muslim Network put out a report that, condemned the gross, and I'm sorry I keep saying gross, but it's hard to think of a better word for it really, the absolute kind of outright Islamophobia among the Labour right, and in a kind of Pavlovian fashion, because they probably felt they had to. Keir Starmer and David Evans said that they were going to implement everything in that report. And, I don't think there's been a single councillor, a single MP, a single member disciplined for racism towards Gypsy people, racism towards Muslims. Even when we've seen the right say stuff that has been condemned as anti-Semitic, they have, got a little kind of tap on the wrist and then been allowed to just continue in their jobs. And, the complete double standard of this is absolutely glaring. And again, if we had a media in this country that was worth the name, the people that are on our TV screens or on our newspaper shop shelves in the morning, then, there would be mass scandal and the Starmer and other people would be hounded out of their positions. They wouldn't be allowed to stay in because they're not fit to be in them. And, this is the state of things. The supposed opposition has, is in many ways as bad as, or sometimes even worse than, the Tories in terms of the way that they conduct themselves, and shamelessly so. A couple of questions coming in there. I think this one's primarily rhetorical, but what happened to the Ford report? Well, we've seen the resignation of a front bench shadow minister today from Keir Starmer's team, because she was one of a number of black MPs who said that, they had deep concerns about the anti-black racism that was revealed in the leaked Labour report, and the Ford report on this, this leak and the events that led up to it has been indefinitely postponed and just keeps getting put back and put back and put back. So they protested against that, and now she's ended up resigning from the front bench. Are the two linked? Well, we don't know yet, but it's hard to imagine that they're not. And then we've got a question here for Paul, if I can find it, from N17 Creative Action. Can Paul say what has been the response of Labour councillors in Haringey to the bullying of tenants?
That's a bit hard to tell, really, to be honest. I think there's been a lot more behind the scenes than what we know about. What honestly tends to happen is that the council is centred around a major project like the demolition of Love Lane. They call it High Road West because they have to rebrand the name of the area. But if there was ever an award for corporate commitment to a project, Haringey Council would definitely win it for High Road West. I would certainly nominate them. They've supported that project, right or wrong, for 10 years, whether people like it or not. And at one level, you can almost admire that. And what's tended to happen is that councillors have gone along with it. Now, councillors tried to improve the scheme. They've tried to rescue the scheme. And at the end of the day, they've been told, well, they were told by the GLA, is the reality, I think. I think the new leadership came in. They went to the GLA and said, we want to change this. And the GLA said, no. The GLA then said, of course, we're putting £90 million into this and there won't be a penny unless you do what we want you to do. And that is the kind of thing which goes on. It goes on all the time across all areas of public policy. We need politicians to stand up against this. And this inevitably is difficult. I was really pleased just to go on a bit, but Darren, previously you were mentioning the name Bernie Grant, really important person, not just the first left black council leader and MP, but somebody who did things differently in Haringey. When I moved to Haringey, I was told by the Labour Party comrades, Bernie did this, Bernie did that. And basically he stood his ground. He explained things. He held meetings. He held group meetings. He held open group meetings that any other members could come along to, and he talked to the officers like somebody with a political mandate that was going to do things differently. The new sheriff in town, when he moved into Haringey, they held meetings with the council officers and said, "We're going to have an anti-racist policy. We're going to have an anti-racism audit." These things were unknown. This is 1980s. These things are unknown in local government, and basically said to the officers, "This is what we're going to do. If you don't like it, you don't have to go along with it, but in which case you don't obstruct, you leave, and if you stay here, you carry out this policy. And it was a remarkable story where it's something which I've researched and talking to some of the people that were there, how the chief executive became so committed to what Bernie did that he went into situations of danger during some of the uprisings that took place in the 1980s. And I thought, how the hell did effectively a career civil servant do that? The answer is leadership. The answer is leadership and political commitment, saying this is what we're going to do, and you will carry people with you. We should never underestimate what happens if you go out and you put a case and that people will respond. If they didn't respond, then we'll go away and think again. But what we often find is they do that, and this is the kind of politics that we need at all levels in the Labour movement.
Well, yeah, if you actually stand for something, it's amazing what can happen. But I will point out as well that again, from the coverage of recent events in Haringey, I mean the plot, and it was there was a plot to topple the black council leader Joe Ejiofor in Haringey, was condemned by many as a racist coup because of the kind of racial undertones of the way he was treated. People associated with the faction that took control had tweeted a picture of him, if I remember correctly, as dressed up as an African dictator, and treating him like it was some sort of kind of tin pot ruler or whatever that wasn't fit for the job, when actually he was very popular among voters, as I understand it. We saw other members of that faction be make racist comments about black people. We saw one person get be I think suspended for bullying an elderly Jewish woman, and yet ultimately no action taken against her. So where these things overlap really is the Labour right getting away with murder, whether that's in terms of their kind of housing plans and this kind of stuff, not just in Haringey but up and down the country, but also that racism seems to be absolutely fine as far as the Labour Party is concerned, as long as you're on their wing of the party, and they'll prioritise protecting their faction above doing the right thing for oppressed communities and minorities, etc. Anytime they think they can get away with it, and every once in a while they might throw somebody, to the lions just as a token move to say that they're doing something. But it doesn't take very long before those people then get allowed back in. And again, in Haringey, we've seen a recent situation where I think a former councillor, and this is only in the last couple of weeks, has been readmitted to the party now, having previously made deeply offensive comments about a Muslim woman councillor, Labour councillor in the borough. Wondering, I won't even say they have a different rule for themselves, because they're just prepared to ignore any rule that doesn't suit them at the time when it doesn't suit them, and then use the rules in their favour whenever they can. So we are. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it is an uphill struggle to try to get anything done against these right wingers, because they have no scruples and no kind of qualms about anything that they do. And we, on the left, by and large, we have principles. So, but that's why solidarity and actually working together becomes so essential, because it's the only way you're going to get anywhere against these people. It is just like fighting the Tories, and that's the tragedy of it at the moment. We have, red rosetted Tories and blue rosetted Tories, but you've got to fight them all, really. Gents, we've about come to the end of the show. Does anybody want to put a last couple of minutes in before we round off and say goodnight to people?
I would just like to refer to Momentum held a Democratic policy primary earlier this year, in which they chose, members got to vote for which policies they wish to prioritise going into the Labour Party conference, which is taking place in Brighton in a couple of weeks. And among the policies that were voted through was one called Build Council Housing and End Homelessness, which has kind of a lot of solutions to the kind of things that we've been discussing here this evening. And I'm going to be in Brighton for the Labour Party conference, although I'm not allowed to enter, obviously. I'll be around kind of like getting involved in doing some work, doing some campaigning, particularly on behalf of this policy motion. So this motion was submitted by the Labour campaign for council housing, the Labour homelessness campaign, and momentum local groups in Wandsworth, Redcar, Middlesbrough, East Cleveland, Bristol, and Hounslow. So I would just like to give a shout out to see if we can get people to support this motion going into conference, because one thing that's worth reflecting on is that the left have won every single internal one member, one vote democratic battle that's taken place within the Labour Party since Keir Starmer was elected. Whenever an issue has been put to the members, the left always wins, because the only way that the right can win, as you've alluded to, is through anti-democratic measures, through kind of stitch-ups, and through kind of like removing the voice of the members. So I think it's really important that any of your viewers and any of your delegates who are going into this conference can support these motions that were democratically selected, particularly this one on housing. So if you are going to Brighton, please try to support this motion. Please join us. We'll have a stall outside. We'll be distributing leaflets. We might be doing some protest actions. So I just wanted to give out a shout out to that.
Yes. Well, quickly, there's a question from Kay Smith saying, let us know what the homelessness campaign is.
Yeah, so there's something called the Labour Campaign for Council Housing, and there's also another campaign, a group called the Labour Homelessness Campaign, and they are behind this motion, which has made it through the Momentum Policy Primary, so that we've got this motion going into conference on build council housing and end homelessness. So what we need to happen is that when we get into the conference, or when delegates get into the conference, and members get to choose what their priorities are going to be, we need to try to get some rally support behind motions like this one. I'm particularly asking people to support this motion so that it becomes one of the 10 that get prioritized and get debated on the conference floor, and then we get an opportunity to vote on it or not. Because we might have our differences as Labour Party members, people on the left, people on the centre, and people on the right, but I believe that all Labour Party members do want to do things like end homelessness. I think that all Labour Party members do want to see things like social housing, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum. There might be people that at the top who might not agree with those aims, but I think that people that we would consider to be on the Labour right do support those aims. So I think it's the kind of motion that everyone can get behind and that we can actually build some unity around. So that's why I'd like to ask people to do.
Mm. Very good. I think we'll round it up there. I will just remind people from what I said at the beginning of the program, we did have other guests lined up who felt too afraid, I think really is the word for it, to come on and appear publicly, even though they're being targeted by the Labour Party in despicable ways. I fully sympathise with that decision and that position, but on the other hand, people have to stand up. So I really appreciate you guys coming and standing up for what's right against the powers that be and the establishment structures that are meant to keep things the same for the benefits of the so-called elites, etc. And I will say, if you're watching this on catch up, thank you for doing that. Do make sure that you spread the word on this, share the links around from this on your favorite social media channel. People do need to get informed about what's going on, because if we stay in ignorance, then all this stuff goes on behind our back and they can do whatever the hell they want and we won't even know about it. So I appreciate that. And I really thank you all for your time. Join us again next week on Skwawk Talk, and keep your eye out for other socialist teleprogramming coming through the week. Take care.
Thank you, comrades.
Thanks.